Something just shifted, and it's not small. Within hours, a clip featuring Gene Deal started circulating across timelines, and suddenly the conversation around Jay-Z went from quiet speculation to full-blown scrutiny. The headline everyone's repeating? That Jay is running scared. But before you buy into that, there's a lot you need to unpack, because what's going viral isn't just the clip, it's the reaction. The video itself doesn't come with hard proof. It's a mix of claims, old stories, and bold interpretations, exactly the kind of content that spreads fast when a name this big is attached. Within minutes, reposts were everywhere. Edits, captions, reaction threads, each one pushing the idea that something major is about to happen. And once that narrative starts moving, it doesn't slow down. Then came the comparisons. People started tying Jay-Z's name to other recent industry controversies, bringing up past moments, old interviews, and headlines that had nothing to do with the current situation, until now. The timeline became a collage of "remember this" posts, turning separate events into one continuous story. And just like that, a single viral clip began to feel like part of something much bigger. But here's where it gets interesting. There's been no direct statement from Jay-Z. No confirmation, no denial, no visible reaction at all. And in situations like this, silence can be read in 100 different ways. Some see it as calm confidence. Others read it as strategic distance. And a few take it as proof that there's more going on behind the scenes. Meanwhile, industry voices are split. Some are warning people not to treat viral claims as facts, pointing out how often online narratives outrun reality. Others are leaning into the drama, asking why certain topics keep resurfacing and why specific names keep getting pulled back into the spotlight. So what are we actually looking at here? Is this just another moment where the internet takes a clip and builds a story around it, or is there a reason this one is hitting differently? Because if you think this is just about one video going viral, you're missing the bigger picture. The way this story is evolving, fast, loud, and full of assumptions, says more about how narratives are created than it does about any single person involved. And what comes next might not just clarify things. It might completely change how this whole situation is being understood. To understand why this moment is blowing up the way it is, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture, because what's happening right now didn't just come out of nowhere. The reaction to that viral clip involving Gene Deal isn't just about what was said, it's about years of history, perception, and how people have viewed Jay-Z for a long time. Jay-Z isn't just another name in the industry. He's built one of the most recognizable legacies in music and business over decades. From his early days coming out of Brooklyn to becoming a global figure, his story has always been framed as one of growth, strategy, and control. He wasn't just making music, he was building an empire. And because of that, the way people talk about him has always been different. There's always been this idea that Jay operates on another level. Not just as an artist, but as someone who understands how power moves behind the scenes. Deals, partnerships, positioning, his name has consistently been associated with influence, not just popularity. And when someone reaches that level, something else comes with it automatically. Scrutiny. Because the bigger the figure, the more people want to understand what's really going on behind the scenes. And over the years, that curiosity has turned into speculation more than once. Different voices have come forward at different times, sharing stories, perspectives, or opinions about how things operate at that level of the industry. Some of those conversations faded quickly. Others stuck around longer. But none of them ever fully disappeared. That's what makes this current situation different. Because when a clip like this goes viral, it doesn't exist on its own, it connects to everything people think they already know. And that's exactly what happened here. The moment the video started spreading, people didn't just watch it, they attached it to past narratives, past rumors, and past discussions that had been sitting in the background. And suddenly, it all felt connected. Now, add another layer to this. Diddy. For years, Jay-Z and Diddy have been mentioned in similar conversations, not necessarily because of direct actions, but because of their positions in the industry. Both built massive influence. Both moved in the same circles. And because of that, whenever something happens involving one, the other's name often gets pulled into the conversation. That connection, real or assumed, has been part of how people interpret stories like this. So when discussions around Diddy started intensifying recently, it didn't take long for people to start looking at Jay-Z again through that same lens. Not because of confirmed links to any specific situation, but because the public tends to group powerful figures together when trying to make sense of complex narratives. And that's where things start to build. Because now, instead of one isolated moment, you have multiple threads being tied together into a single story, even if those threads don't actually connect in a clear, factual way. At the same time, you have to consider how the internet works. Information doesn't move slowly anymore. It moves instantly. And more importantly, it evolves as it spreads. A clip gets posted. Someone reacts to it. Another person adds context. A third person brings up something from years ago. And before you know it, the original piece of content has turned into something completely different. That's exactly what's happening here. The Gene Deal clip didn't just stay as a clip. It became a starting point. From there, people began revisiting older stories, interviews, incidents, moments that were already known but now felt relevant again. And once those pieces are reintroduced into the conversation, they don't come back the same way they originally appeared. They come back amplified, reframed, and often misunderstood. And the more that happens, the more intense the narrative becomes. But here's the key thing to understand. There's a difference between discussion and confirmation. Right now, most of what's driving this situation falls into the category of discussion. People are analyzing, reacting, questioning, but not necessarily working with verified information. And yet, the way it's being presented online makes it feel like something definitive is happening. That gap between perception and reality is where stories like this grow the fastest. Because when people feel like they're uncovering something, they engage more. They share more. They react more. And that engagement keeps the story alive, even if the original source doesn't provide clear answers. And then there's the silence factor. Jay-Z hasn't publicly addressed the viral clip. No statement, no clarification, no direct response. And just like in other high-profile situations, that silence is being interpreted in different ways depending on who you ask. Some see it as calculated, choosing not to amplify something that might fade on its own. Others see it as strategic, waiting for the right moment, if any, to respond. And then there are those who view silence as suspicious, assuming that not responding means there's something to hide. Three completely different interpretations, all based on the same lack of information. That's the environment this situation is unfolding in. And it's important to recognize that this isn't new. Public figures at this level deal with waves like this all the time. Moments where attention spikes, narratives form, and conversations take on a life of their own. Most of the time, those waves pass without anything concrete happening. But occasionally, they lead to something bigger. The challenge is knowing which one you're looking at in real time. Because from the outside, both scenarios can look exactly the same in the early stages. Right now, what we're seeing is a combination of all these elements coming together at once. A viral clip. A well-known figure. Existing narratives. High public interest. And a lack of clear answers. That combination is powerful. It creates momentum. And once momentum builds, it becomes very difficult to slow down. But here's the part that really matters. Just because a story is moving fast doesn't mean it's complete. In fact, in most cases like this, the fastest moving version of the story is also the least accurate. Details get lost. Context gets removed. And what remains is a simplified version that's easier to share, but not necessarily closer to the truth. And that's where we are right now. At a point where the conversation is loud, the reactions are strong, but the full picture isn't clear yet. Which brings us to the next phase. Because once the background is set, and the narrative starts building, there's always a moment where everything either comes together, or starts to fall apart. And based on how fast this situation is evolving, that moment might be closer than people think. Everything snapped into place the moment the clip stopped being just a clip and turned into a full-blown storyline. Within hours of Gene Deal's video gaining traction, the conversation around Jay-Z shifted from curiosity to confrontation. It wasn't just people watching anymore, they were reacting, questioning, and building narratives faster than anyone could keep up with. At first, it looked like a typical viral moment. A bold claim gets posted, people debate it, and then it fades. But this time, it didn't fade. It grew. And the reason it grew is because the claims didn't stay isolated. They started connecting. Pieces from the past began resurfacing, old interviews, previous headlines, moments that had already been discussed years ago but were now being pulled back into the spotlight with a completely different meaning. Suddenly, things that once felt unrelated started being treated like parts of the same puzzle. And once that puzzle started forming, the conflict became real. Because now, instead of one viral video, you had an entire narrative building around the idea that Jay-Z's position, his control, his influence, was being questioned in a way people hadn't seen before. That's a big shift. Especially for someone whose public image has always been built on precision, strategy, and staying ahead of situations rather than reacting to them. But here's where things really started to escalate. The internet didn't wait for confirmation. It filled in the gaps. People began interpreting the video as proof of something bigger. Threads popped up breaking down what this means. Reaction videos framed it as a turning point. Headlines started leaning into phrases like pressure building and things catching up. And just like that, the narrative changed from white right pointing backhand index, did you see this clip? To white right pointing backhand index, something is happening. That shift is everything. Because once people believe something is happening, they start looking for evidence to support that belief, even if the evidence isn't actually there. And that's exactly what happened next. More voices entered the conversation. Not all at once, but enough to amplify the situation. Some referenced industry dynamics. Others spoke in general terms about power structures. A few hinted that certain topics had been known for a long time but never fully discussed publicly. None of it was direct. None of it was confirmed. But together, it created the feeling that this moment wasn't random. It felt like a build-up. And then came the silence. No response from Jay-Z. No pushback. No clarification. No attempt to directly address the claims. And that silence? It became the loudest part of the story. Because in high-profile situations, silence doesn't exist in a vacuum, it gets interpreted. Some people saw it as confidence, a decision not to give attention to something that would eventually fade. Others saw it as strategic restraint, waiting for the right moment to respond. But another group saw it very differently. They saw it as pressure. As if the lack of response meant there was something bigger happening behind the scenes, something that couldn't be addressed quickly or easily. And once that interpretation entered the conversation, everything escalated. Because now, the story wasn't just about what was said in the video. It was about what wasn't being said anywhere else. That's when the conflict reached its peak. You had one side pushing the narrative that this was a turning point, that long-standing questions were finally gaining traction. And on the other side, you had people pushing back, arguing that the entire situation was being exaggerated beyond reality. Two completely different perspectives, colliding in real time. And neither one slowing down. But here's where the first real twist begins to emerge. Because while the narrative was growing louder, something wasn't adding up. If this was truly a major situation, something significant enough to shake a figure like Jay-Z, where were the credible confirmations? Where were the verified sources backing up the claims? The deeper people looked, the more they realized that most of what was driving the conversation wasn't coming from confirmed information. It was coming from interpretation. From connections people were making on their own. From the way separate pieces of information were being combined into a single story. And that realization started creating cracks in the narrative. Because once you question the foundation of a story, everything built on top of it becomes uncertain. But here's the problem. By the time those cracks appear, the story is already everywhere. Millions of people have already seen it, already reacted to it, already formed opinions. So even when doubt starts creeping in, it doesn't stop the momentum, it just changes the conversation. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" people start asking, "What part of this is true?" And that's a much more complicated question. Because now, you're not dealing with one clear claim, you're dealing with multiple layers of information, some accurate, some misunderstood, and some completely speculative. And separating those layers in real time? Almost impossible. Meanwhile, the narrative continues to evolve. Some accounts double down, adding more context, more connections, more theories. Others start pulling back, acknowledging that things might not be as clear as they first appeared. And right in the middle of it, the original video keeps circulating, gaining more views, reaching new audiences, starting the cycle all over again. That's when the situation takes its most interesting turn. Because the focus begins to shift. Not away from Jay-Z, but away from the idea that the video itself is the full story. Instead, people start looking at the bigger picture. How narratives form. How quickly they spread. How easily perception can be shaped when information moves faster than verification. And that's the twist. Because what initially looked like a direct challenge to Jay-Z's position starts to look more like a case study in how viral moments are built. But even with that shift, the tension doesn't disappear. Because once a narrative reaches this level, it doesn't need to be fully true to keep going. It just needs to be believable enough. And right now, it is. Which means the conflict isn't over. If anything, it's just entering its next phase. Because the more people question what's real and what isn't, the more attention the story gets. And attention? That's what keeps everything moving. So now we're left in a very specific place. A story that feels massive, but isn't fully confirmed. A narrative that's loud, but not fully clear. And a situation where the truth hasn't caught up yet. Which raises one final question heading into what comes next. If this really is just a viral moment built on interpretation, then why does it feel like something bigger is still about to happen? Just when it seemed like the conversation had peaked, like the clip had already done all the damage it could, something unexpected happened. It didn't die down. It intensified. Because while people were still debating what Gene Deal actually meant, a second wave of content started flooding in. Not new evidence. Not confirmed updates. But interpretations, stronger, louder, and more confident than before. Threads got longer. Videos got more dramatic. And suddenly, the story wasn't just being discussed. It was being expanded. Now, instead of focusing on one viral clip, people began building entire timelines around Jay-Z. Old moments were reintroduced with new context. Past interviews were clipped into short segments and reposted as proof. Even unrelated events started getting pulled in, creating the illusion of a continuous pattern. And that's where things took a serious turn. Because once multiple pieces, real or not, are presented together, they stop looking like isolated moments. They start looking like a system. A narrative that feels complete, even if it isn't. And the internet? It locked onto that version fast. At this point, it wasn't about whether the original claims were accurate anymore. It was about how convincing the overall picture looked. And the more content people saw, the more that picture felt real. But here's where it gets dangerous. Because the louder the narrative became, the less people questioned where it came from. Some of the most viral posts weren't backed by credible sources. They were edited clips, out-of-context statements, or opinions presented as facts. Yet they spread just as quickly, sometimes even faster, than verified information ever could. And once that happens, the line between reality and perception starts to blur. Now add another layer to this. Silence. Jay-Z still hadn't responded. No interview. No statement. No attempt to shut anything down. And that silence? It stopped being neutral. It started being interpreted as part of the story itself. Some people saw it as control, choosing not to engage with something that would eventually burn out. Others saw it as strategy, waiting for the right moment to respond when the noise reached its peak. But a growing number of people saw it differently. They saw it as pressure. As if the situation had reached a level where responding immediately wasn't an option. And whether that idea was true or not didn't matter, because once it entered the conversation, it changed how everything else was viewed. Now, every new post, every reaction, every piece of content was filtered through that assumption. And that's when the narrative reached its most intense phase. Because at this point, it wasn't just about a viral moment anymore. It felt like momentum. Like something building. And then, the first cracks started to show. Quiet at first. Almost easy to miss. A few users began questioning specific details. They pointed out inconsistencies in timelines. They noticed that certain clips were being reused in different contexts. They asked where the original claims actually came from. And when people started tracing those claims back, they didn't lead to clear answers. Some led to opinion-based content. Others traced back to accounts known for exaggeration or speculation. And a few simply couldn't be verified at all. That's when the tone began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Because now, instead of one dominant narrative, there were two. White right pointing back hand index 1 saying something serious was unfolding. White right pointing back hand index another questioning whether the entire situation was being overstated. And that split changed everything. Because once doubt enters a viral story, it doesn't stop it, it complicates it. Now people weren't just reacting emotionally. They were analyzing. Debating. Comparing versions. And the deeper they looked, the more one realization started to stand out. The story had grown far beyond the original clip. At this point, the Gene Deal video wasn't even the main focus anymore. It had become the spark, but everything else came from how people reacted to it. And that leads to the most important reveal in this entire situation. The narrative wasn't built on one confirmed event. It was built on accumulation. Layers of interpretation stacked on top of each other until they formed something that felt complete, even without solid confirmation. And once a story reaches that level, it becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't need new facts to keep going. It just needs attention. And right now, it has plenty of it. But here's the part that changes how you see everything. Even as doubt started appearing, even as people began questioning the accuracy of certain claims, the overall perception didn't fully collapse. Because by that point, the story had already done its job. It had captured attention. It had created discussion. It had shaped opinions. And once that happens, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. That's the shocking reveal. Not that something definitive has been proven, but that a narrative can reach this level of impact without needing full confirmation. Because in the current landscape, perception moves faster than facts. And once perception is set, it tends to stick, even when new information comes in. Which brings us to the final layer of this situation. Because even with everything that's happened, the viral clip, the reactions, the debates, the contradictions, there's still one thing missing. Closure. No clear conclusion. No definitive answer. Just a story that continues to evolve in real time. And that's what keeps it alive. Because when something feels unresolved, people don't move on. They stay engaged. They keep watching. They wait for the next update. So now the question isn't just what happened. It's what happens next. Because if this situation continues to build the way it has been, the next development might not just add to the story. It might completely change it. Once the clip featuring Gene Deal went fully viral, the reaction wasn't just fast, it was overwhelming. Within hours, the conversation around Jay-Z spread across every corner of social media, and what made this moment different wasn't just the volume of reactions, it was how divided they were. At first, the public response followed a familiar pattern. Shock. Curiosity. Then immediate judgment. A large portion of viewers took the clip at face value. They interpreted the claims as something serious, something that suggested there might be more going on behind the scenes than people had previously realized. These users didn't wait for confirmation, they reacted instantly, sharing the video, adding their own commentary, and pushing the narrative forward at full speed. But at the same time, another group stepped in with a completely different perspective. They questioned everything. Where did the claims come from? What evidence actually supports them? Why are old stories suddenly being presented as new developments? These questions didn't stop the conversation, they split it. Now, instead of one unified reaction, there were two competing narratives forming in real time. One driven by emotion and momentum, the other by skepticism and caution. And that divide created a level of engagement that pushed the story even further into the spotlight. Because conflict doesn't just exist within the story. It exists in the audience too. And that's exactly what happened here. Meanwhile, media outlets began amplifying the situation in their own way. Not necessarily by confirming anything, but by highlighting the fact that the clip was trending. Headlines focused on the viral nature of the moment, the reactions it generated, and the broader conversation it sparked. But here's the key detail. The most widely shared headlines weren't the most balanced ones. They were the most dramatic. Phrases like controversy, pressure, and questions rising started appearing more frequently, not because they were confirmed, but because they captured attention. And in a digital environment where clicks and engagement drive visibility, that kind of framing spreads faster than careful analysis ever could. At the same time, industry voices reacted very differently. People within the music and entertainment space showed more restraint. Instead of jumping to conclusions, many of them focused on the bigger picture, how situations like this tend to unfold, how narratives can spiral, and how easily perception can shift when a story gains momentum. Some pointed out that viral clips rarely tell the full story. Others emphasized that high-profile figures often face waves of speculation that don't lead to anything concrete. And a few highlighted how important it is to separate discussion from verified information, especially when the stakes involve someone with a long-standing public legacy. That contrast between public reaction and industry reaction created an interesting dynamic. On one side, you had millions of people reacting in real time, driven by emotion, curiosity, and the speed of information. On the other, you had insiders who seemed more focused on context, patterns, and how these situations usually play out behind the scenes. And that difference matters. Because it shows that the same situation can be interpreted in completely different ways depending on perspective. But even within the industry, the reactions weren't completely unified. Some voices leaned into the conversation, not necessarily confirming anything, but acknowledging that certain discussions had existed for a long time. They didn't present new facts, they simply reinforced the idea that this moment wasn't entirely unexpected. And that subtle reinforcement was enough to keep the narrative alive. Because even without confirmation, the suggestion that this has been talked about before adds weight to the story in the eyes of the audience. Meanwhile, social media continued evolving. What started as reactions to a single clip turned into deeper analysis threads, long-form breakdowns, and even debates about how information spreads in the first place. People weren't just talking about Jay-Z anymore, they were talking about the system that creates viral narratives. Questions like, why do certain stories blow up while others don't? How do past events get reinterpreted when new content surfaces? And how much of what we believe is based on facts versus repetition? Those conversations added another layer to the situation. Because now, the focus wasn't just on what was being said, it was on how it was being said, and why it was being received the way it was. And through all of this, one thing remained consistent. Silence from Jay-Z. No direct response. No attempt to address the viral clip. No engagement with the narrative at all. And that silence continued to shape the reaction. For some, it reinforced the idea that he was choosing not to give attention to something that might fade on its own. For others, it raised more questions: why stay quiet if the claims are gaining this much traction? But regardless of how it was interpreted, the silence kept the conversation going. Because when there's no clear response, people don't stop talking. They keep speculating. They revisit details. They search for new angles. And that ongoing engagement is what keeps a story like this alive far beyond its original moment. At this stage, the reactions themselves have become part of the story. It's no longer just about the clip, or even the claims within it. It's about how millions of people responded, how narratives formed, and how quickly perception shifted based on limited information. And that's what makes this phase so important. Because it shows that the impact of a situation like this isn't determined solely by what's true or false. It's determined by how people react to it. And right now, the reactions are still evolving. Some are becoming more cautious. Others are doubling down. And many are simply waiting to see what happens next before forming a final opinion. But one thing is clear. This story hasn't reached its conclusion yet. Because as long as the conversation continues, as long as new perspectives keep emerging, and as long as there's no definitive answer, the narrative will keep moving. And when it does finally settle, the question won't just be what happened. It'll be whether the reaction matched reality at all. Just when it looked like the conversation had reached its peak, like every angle had been debated and every reaction had already played out, something about this situation still didn't feel complete. Because if this was really just a viral moment, if the clip from Gene Deal was simply another piece of content that the internet ran with, then why does the story still feel like it's building instead of slowing down? That's the part nobody is fully addressing. On the surface, everything seems straightforward. A video goes viral, people react, narratives form, and eventually things settle. That's how these moments usually work. But here, the pattern isn't following that script. Instead of fading, the discussion is evolving. New interpretations keep appearing. Old clips are being revisited again and again. Conversations that should have cooled off are staying active, almost like something is keeping the momentum alive. And when that happens, it usually means one of two things. Either the story hasn't fully been understood yet, or there's more to come. And that's where the final twist begins to take shape. Because the more you look at how this situation unfolded, the less it feels like a single event, and the more it starts to look like a chain reaction. One piece of content triggers another. One reaction leads to a deeper discussion. And before you realize it, you're no longer looking at the original clip, you're looking at an entire narrative that built itself around it. But here's the key detail most people missed. That narrative wasn't built on confirmed facts. It was built on interpretation. On connections people made in real time. On assumptions that filled in gaps. On the way separate pieces of information were combined into something that felt complete, even if it wasn't fully verified. And once that kind of narrative forms, it becomes hard to separate from reality. Because now, people aren't just reacting to what actually happened, they're reacting to what they believe happened. And belief, especially at this scale, is powerful enough to carry a story forward even without new evidence. That's the real twist. Not that something definitive has been proven, but that a story this big can exist without needing that level of proof to survive. Now take that one step further. Because if this situation was able to reach this level purely through momentum, interpretation, and reaction, what happens if something real does emerge later? What happens if new information, actual, verified information, gets introduced into a narrative that's already this large? That's when things shift completely. Because now, instead of building a story from scratch, you're adding fuel to something that's already burning. And when that happens, the impact isn't gradual, it's immediate. And that's why this moment feels unfinished. Because even though the conversation has been loud, intense, and widespread, it hasn't reached a clear conclusion. There's no final answer. No definitive explanation. Just a series of reactions layered on top of each other. And in situations like this, that lack of closure doesn't calm things down. It keeps them alive. It keeps people watching. Waiting. Looking for the next development that might finally connect everything together. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the people at the center of this story, especially Jay-Z, haven't changed their behavior in a way that matches the intensity of the narrative. No sudden public responses. No visible shifts. No confirmation of anything being claimed. And that disconnect raises an important question. If something major was actually happening behind the scenes, wouldn't we see some kind of reflection of it publicly? Or is it possible that the narrative has grown far beyond the reality of the situation itself? That's the tension this story is sitting in right now. Between perception and reality. Between what's being said and what's actually known. And until those two things align, the story won't fully settle. Which brings us to the cliffhanger. Because at this point, there are only two directions this situation can go. Either the narrative slowly fades as attention moves elsewhere, becoming just another example of how quickly stories can spiral online. Or something new drops. Something that either confirms, challenges, or completely reshapes everything people think they understand right now. And if that second scenario happens, then everything we've seen so far won't be the story. It'll just be the beginning of it. So before you decide what's real and what isn't, before you lock in your opinion based on what's trending right now, ask yourself one question. Are you reacting to facts? Or to a narrative that hasn't finished unfolding yet? Because if this situation has proven anything, it's that the biggest twist might not have happened yet. And when it does, it won't just add to the story. It might rewrite it completely. So now it all comes down to you, after everything you've just seen, broken down, and questioned, what do you actually believe is going on here? Do you think the viral clip from Gene Deal really points to something bigger involving Jay-Z, or is this another moment where the internet took a piece of content and built a whole story around it? And be real about it. Are people reacting to facts, or reacting to how the story feels? Drop your opinion in the comments right now. Don't just say yes or no, break it down. Tell me what part of this you think is actually real, what feels exaggerated, and where you think this story is heading next. Because the craziest part about situations like this is that everyone sees it differently, and sometimes the comment section ends up being more revealing than the video itself. If you made it this far, you already know this wasn't just another quick headline. This was a full deep dive into how narratives form, how they spread, and how quickly perception can take over before the full truth even has a chance to catch up. So if you want more content like this, where we don't just repeat what's trending but actually break it down, make sure you hit that like button. It really helps push these videos out and keeps the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't just end, they evolve. And when the next update drops, you already know we're going to be right here breaking it down before everyone else catches up. So stay locked in. Because the next twist in this story might not just answer questions. It might change everything you think you know.